And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. The one and only Joanna Bogle is here as our guest author. Her new book, John Paul II, Man of Prayer, The Spiritual Life of a Saint, published by Gracewing. Oh, it's great to have you here.
It's great
back
to be
across
back.
the pond,
Yes.
here in the States, and working once more at EWTN. People follow you on your blogs and find out where Auntie might be at any given time or day on the web. And also, you were on with Father Mitch last month. And it's perfect timing because in a few weeks we're going to be dealing with the canonization of John Paul II and John the 23rd. And you've got this new book about John Paul II, and you even have a little prayer book that relates to both of them, right?
Yes, and I just think this is an incredibly exciting event in the life of the church. And very excitingly, Jamie and I will be going to the canonization.
Oh, you're going to be able to go?
Yes,
Great.
we're staying with friends, and it's going to be a lot of fun, except that it isn't. I bet we're squashed into the back of the neck of the person in front, jolly uncomfortable, wanting a glass of water and all that. Who cares? We'll be among the millions there.
Right. Do you ever, those experiences like that, while you're going through them, sometimes can be difficult, and they later become one of the greatest moments of your life.
Yes.
Because memory is a wonderful thing that the downside parts kind of fade away and only the good part remains. I think that's one of God's great gifts to human beings. Probably.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
He kind of deals with our memory of that. Now, you have done 11 books. Is this your 11th? This would be your 12th then, I think.
I think actually I've done more than that, but I only
That's
realized...
how many books we've done together.
Oh, I see what you mean.
think that's
yeah,
what it is.
More
Okay.
books. I counted it up, but only because I looked it all up on Wikipedia, but it's just better not to count. It's like the years of one's life.
Right,
just
and you
keep
mentioned
going.
Jamie, and of course, I know we did a bookmark with Jamie on, and then you did a couple of series with him, right?
That's right, particularly about history. It's a big
Right,
one
in
of the
Europe,
big things,
and then the military orders and the Crusades, and recently we're going to hopefully premiere actually a documentary that we've done on the Crusades to really put them in the right perspective of understanding how they fit into religious history, in a sense.
That's important. That's important. Jamie and I will be watching that one, really enjoying that.
Right. Now, the latest one, and it ties into this book, is a series you're doing on the footsteps of John Paul the Great. Now, you're doing that with somebody else, right?
Yes. We've got a special program going to be featured the weekend of the canonization that I did with Claire Anderson, with whom I've written this book about John Paul.
Right,
yeah,
okay.
It was a lot of fun. We went to Poland and we walked in the footsteps of John Paul.
So you literally did that?
Literally, yes. Wadowice, where he was born and baptized, Krakow, Częstochowa, and the great shrine at Łagowniki, which is near where he worked in a stone quarry in the years of the war. It was a terrifically interesting time, and Claire and I, we were working on this book about John Paul, and then we walked in his footsteps for this program. It was all just an extraordinary experience, yeah.
Now, didn't you do a book on Blessed John Paul the Great, but you did that one for kids a few years back, right?
That's right. I did a children's book.
So what's I know you've always had a great affection for Pope Benedict, but you had a connection there with John Paul II, too.
Yes,
right?
well, what happened was I came to understand that, the years go by quickly. And when you talk to not just children, but young people, teenagers, even people in their 20s, even including my nieces and nephews, John Paul is already slipping into history. And for a lot of young people in Britain, he almost already occupies the sort of place that, say, Winston Churchill had when I was a young woman. He was jolly important, and the grown-ups admired him, but he belonged to recent history. And it would be a tragedy if this...
And the prior generation, in a
That's
sense.
exactly
Right,
that.
right.
This is of importance to people who remember. Sort of 1980s stuff. And there's so much more. It'd be a tragedy if John Paul was too quickly relegated to a scrapbook, somebody you paste in pictures and do a school project on him.
Especially since he had such a wonderful impact on the church, really.
Yes.
I think,
Yes.
I mean, to have people called the John Paul II generation.
Yes.
And for us to see that out there.
And I'm conscious there is a John Paul generation, very conscious, and we're beginning to notice that, particularly in our seminaries, and among young people who are now in their late 20s and 30s and are marrying, having families. I see that in my own family, the quality of the young people's faith, which in the first instance I would say owes much to their parents, my brother and his wife, but also to the culture, yes. And that whole World Youth Day thing, the way you are a Catholic is joyful, fun, hard work. It's much more relaxed and informal in one way and much more committed in another. I think it's very attractive, but they don't know enough about him. They don't know his life. They really see him as just a marvelous figure of inspiration, and I wanted to flesh that out a lot more.
In this book. Now, how did you and Claire Anderson come to work together? This isn't the first thing you've worked together on, right?
It is and it isn't. We got to know each other, golly, it's about 20 or 30 years ago. Actually, initially through the excellent Women for Faith and Family here in America. We were 2 British women on their mailing list, and somebody put us in touch. Well, at that stage, she was raising a family, and I was an army wife, and I think we would speak on the phone perhaps twice a year or something. For 3, 4, 5 years, it was like that, or a bit more, maybe 7, 8, 10 years. And then a few years ago, her children grown up, life was busy, but not so busy, and we'd meet occasionally for lunch, and we really clicked. And there is this very jolly feeling with Catholic women, and Claire is one of a network, one could say, of Catholic women in and around London, where we all know we can rely on each other to do things. So you spend a hot afternoon wrapping up Bibles to send to a school, and you're working on a huge project for school involving reading lots of kids' essays and grabbing a sandwich. It's fun, it's also hard work, a bit of a commitment, and you're stuffing stuff into a car and driving around and hoping the milk doesn't splash over. It's jolly. But it's hard work. It's a nice relationship. It's a nice working relationship.
Now, you're a writer, and you've written. Was that her background, or what was her background?
No, we first met through this Women for Faith and Family, but she was already writing, and I got her to do some regular columns for a little magazine I was then editing, and that really worked well. In those days, remember, before the internet, when things arrived by post, she would do a typed copy, keep a carbon, one might talk on the phone. Yes, from the beginning it was, I would say, a working relationship. And then, because we liked each other's writing, she was always more interested in the devotional side of our faith. She was rather good at pondering and writing about prayer and union with God. I was more interested in and more capable of writing about sort of history and didactic stuff. So it was a rather good relationship, really, the balance of the writing. And then, as I said, in recent years, slightly less frenetic, especially with family life, we'd actually meet long, and this won't surprise you, talkative lunches, and then we had this idea of a work project together on John Paul, and we've really enjoyed doing it. It's been
Now,
fun.
which came first? The idea of doing the series came first, and out of that came the book, or the parallel?
Book first.
Okay, book was
Book
actually first. Okay.
And we wanted to explore the spiritual life of John Paul, because this idea of him as the great figure, World Youth Day, a lot of people in Britain, especially those who are sort of opposed to the church, would speak of him as an actor. What a personality, he was an actor.
Well, especially if you look into his life, obviously he was involved with acting, he had those gifts, so some people thought, well, he's just memorized the lines and puts them across well.
That's it. And this is so false. First, because the acting was the underground theatre, the rhapsodic theatre, the theatre of the spoken word, you know, under the eyes of the Gestapo, somebody watching at the door. They managed, I think, 40 performances, let's call them that, in the Second World War, in underground, literally, in a basement flat here, somebody's blacked out house there. So this is hardly, you know, sort of the Royal Academy of Drama. I mean, this is absurd. This was a deep, sort of self-taught theatre, exploring deep spiritual issues under the Nazi occupation. So even at that level, it was a very spiritual aspect to John Paul. But what really interested us was this idea of his prayer life, which was extremely intense, warm and deep. And he was a
Right, and you remember those images of him when he'd be praying at times.
That's right.
He was just like he was.
That's right. With
It was
his fists
amazing,
like this.
you know, kind of. I remember when he went to the Holy Land, and I remember he was praying in one particular location. It was just the intensity of that face.
Yes, yes, and a good friend of mine, a couple that Jamie and I are very fond of, who are evangelical Christians. We have a very good friendship with them, and we meet and we pray together and so on. And Rachel went to John Paul's early morning mass, and she remembered this groaning sound,
right.
and she described this, you know. And when we were working on our book, one of Claire's friends, very vividly, we've quoted her in the book, also had this experience. And so this image of John Paul, this memory of this groaning, this deep prayer, and then almost comically, when he's on his long journeys, they had to try to stop him walking in front of a chapel where there was the Blessed Sacrament. He could never pass it. He would go in and then everything would be out for 10, 15 minutes, which is a long time in a busy program. So there was this deep prayer life, and he was soaked in John of the Cross. There was this truly mystical side.
And is that what you found when in walking that footsteps? Could you see from where he grew up, and you talk about his father losing his mother, obviously his brother Edmund as well, dying fairly young.
Yes.
And his background, his friendship with Jersey, etc., which is in here as well. Could you see by walking that path where this came from, where his roots were?
Yes, very much so.
Or at least just the beginnings
of it?
of it?
As the beginnings, yes, very much so, particularly in Wadowice, where he grew up, and the flat, the apartment, you would say, is now a museum and so on. And you could almost lean out and touch the wall of the church from the kitchen window. It's that near. And then there's this clock, a sundial on the side of the church, saying something to the effect that time passes, but what about eternity? So from the beginning, there was this very deep commitment to the Catholic faith. I think they got the flat just because it was convenient in the middle of Wadowice, but to grow up right next to a church. Right. And then, as you say, you walk in his footsteps, the death of his mother, and of this beloved older brother in peculiarly noble circumstances. He's a doctor, he catches a disease from a patient. Right. You know, it's very noble, greater love than this hath no man. And then the war years, and we were particularly interested, this was something Claire discovered that I hadn't really thought about, and it made a big impact on writing in the book, was Jan Tyranowski, who was a layman, who during the war years founded this Living Rosary group. And I hadn't understood the significance of this. John Paul thought of himself as being a layman. He didn't have the conventional devout little boy off to a junior seminary, nothing like that. He imagined he'd live his life as a Catholic layman. So his great influences were lay people, his father, his beloved older brother, Tyranowski. That's very significant and very useful, I think, for us. And in a curious way, absolutely comes to fruition in the authentic message of Vatican II. We are all called to be saints. You know, this is not just something for father, sister. There's this very powerful lay influence on John Paul. Also, this marked his papacy, I think. He was very at ease with everyone, doesn't want to be pretentious. There's nothing remotely clericalist about him. All of this is very attractive and makes his spirituality very accessible to all of us.
Right.
So these were things we discovered, and in my case, I hadn't expected to discover that.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, I remember, reading some of the other works and reading this book and looking at some of the movies and teleplays that have been done. It always struck me to some degree this whole idea of like the theater of the word kind of thing, and say, you would think, is that on the top of the list of things to do during Nazi occupation, to put on plays? What was the genius of that?
Well, the genius of this, it goes all the way back to the 19th century and earlier, when Poland was divided. The only way the Polish language was kept alive in its real sense, a beautiful language, a language of poetry and literature, was by people putting on plays and reading good literature together. And there is sort of an equivalent actually today where in the middle of our cultural and other crisis, to revive good literature, good education, you sometimes have to almost do this privately. And they kept Poland alive because Poland, what is Poland? Poland is the language, the literature, the culture, the traditions, the feasts. And I realized that that's exactly what the Nazis wanted to crush. So if there was to be any Poland afterwards, well, what John Paul, Karol Wojtyła and his friends couldn't know, and just as well they didn't, poor darlings, was that even after the war it would go on being crushed. So what is Poland? How does it survive under communism? Does it become a sort of satellite of Russia, which is certainly what Stalin wanted? So the fact that there is a Poland today owes so much to that keeping alive of the culture, because that's what a nation is. It's a family of families. It's a culture, it's a language.
And I'm sure when you found over there, you found that how interwoven the culture and Catholicism basically are, right?
Yes.
Or at least were.
Yes, and still are, and it's something that needs to be cherished. And also, at its best, this is a very gentle thing. This is not nationalism. This is not a racial thing. This should be a gentle and also outgoing thing, because it's something lovely that you share. And I think this is something we need in Britain, where, we are certainly losing a lot of our culture. We're becoming a tele-addict, soap opera, a junk food, mobile phone, stupid games on your computer. There's no culture in that. And our songs and jokes, particularly our, British sense of humour, and as well as this, of course, our books and so on, literature, drama. Well, I think John Paul exemplified, cherish this, because this is also connected with your faith, with God, and very close, very much in Poland, and that's a lesson from Poland to the world, I think. One of the gifts of John Paul to us, among much else.
And I think, in a sense, like holding on to the faith and connecting over the 2,000 years, as the papacy does for us in many ways. And I was thinking about what you were saying about John Paul II in the sense of the Polish culture. And we see, to some degree, in our kind of post-Christian, postmodern world, where in efforts to be more progressive, we tend to denigrate the past in a lot of ways. Those things are pushed away and are no longer things to be cherished in an attempt, I think, many times to make it easier to change things.
I think that's true. And I think we need to be fully rounded human beings, an incarnational faith. I loved it when Pope Benedict, who was, of course, such a wonderful collaborator with John Paul, he was the theologian and giving us the catechism and so on. The two worked so beautifully together, which was marvelous. You know, the German and the Pole, there's just some beautiful stuff in that. And at one point he was asked about his own relationship between his faith and his culture, his faith and his country. And he says, well, I'm a priest, I belong to everyone, but my heart beats Bavarian. And I think that's such a beautiful idea. You have to link with your past, your family, your culture, your music and so on. And it should be in your heart. And John Paul had this idea, here is Poland, it's in my heart. And I find all this extremely attractive and a very practical message for how we could live.
Now, what was the things I was reading in the book that struck me, which I always think, and you talk about the fact that we always talk about him being such an outdoorsman and skiing, things like that, but also a little bit talking about the fact that when it came to like team sports or football, we'd call soccer here, those things he wasn't so good at.
He wasn't, and in fact it was Claire that got interested in this. She discovered that he was rather clumsy, and it seems likely that it was his older brother who got him playing team sports where there's coordination and so on, because this rather clumsy lad needed that. We can see here perhaps the tender concern of an already medically orientated older brother. Yes, that was something that interested me. And the other thing that's interesting is that he had always, right through to his papacy too, a link between the outdoor life. He was an energetic boy, pre-television, of course. You played a lot outside, and you were sporty, and the inner life, mass every morning, and his friendship with Jerzy, the Jewish friend, and that's itself the most beautiful story, and many fruits for the church in that. He remembers their friendship with football and outdoor games, and also football in the house. They'd push the furniture to one side, it's rather a small flat, and kick a football
Right, because
around.
you kind of talk in the book that they weren't poor, but they certainly were well off, and I guess the father was reasonably austere in the sense of lived a fairly simple life.
Yes, yes. As a lesson for us there, yes, this idea, we always want to have people either sort of frightfully rich and living in a palace, or sort of desperately poor.
Well, certainly if you're into the health and wealth gospel, that would be
Well,
these
yeah,
days.
exactly, you know. And in fact, the Vutti was living in a very modest way. They were not hungry, they were not poor. But yes, the father lived this very austere, prayerful life, a widower, and they'd lost a little baby girl as well earlier. But a house of books and music and talk and laughter and nicely organized meals, and kind friends would cook for them because, you know, this chap's a widower and so on. So in a way, we can identify with this, a very wholesome sort of Catholic childhood, and openness to friends. Bring your friends in, Carol. Yes, you know, that's the way it should be, a place of hospitality.
And it's interesting, too, because I think read a bit, he said that his father and his mother reportedly met at a church in Krakow.
Yes.
It said that the mother of the future pope wanted two sons, a doctor and a priest.
Yes, and she got that. Isn't that sweet? But not in the way she'd expected.
Right, and also this is interesting too, and though we hear that sometimes on the Marian side, where it says the Pope was later to write that his mother's influence on him, quote unquote, must have been great, but he seems to have had few memories of her.
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether it's a boy-girl thing, but I've noticed that men often don't remember their early childhood as well as women do. And she died when he was still small, so I think he only had a faint memory. Although he always kept a picture of his parents by his bed in his room, which is rather sweet. Of course, most of us do that, and that's rather sweet. And I think his father gently fostered this happy memories of his mother. The bit that did annoy me a lot is this idea that his devotion to Mary was a sort of mother substitute.
Yeah, he had to fill in for, and that's why he got so Marian.
Yeah, that's so silly. There's no evidence for this. On the contrary, first he had the deep Marian piety of Poland, image of Our Lady of Częstochowa, and second, it was a very deep theological thing, very much bound up with St. Louis Grignon de Montfort, Totus Tuus. In fact, he had a very academic understanding of Mary as well as a matter of the heart. And this idea, oh, he missed his mum, so he opted for Mary, is to me trite, and is often said by people whose own Marian devotion is minimal or non-existent. They just don't get it. And you need to get Mary and her real significance in the church if you want to get John Paul. I think psychobabble is a rotten substitute, you know.
Well, a lot of times people need to explain things away because it doesn't work for them, so they can't really understand where it came from.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Now, the one thing, too, that I thought was interesting when going back to his friendship with Jerzy was the fact of when he came to the church one time and somebody said, well, you really don't belong here. And he said, doesn't she know we're all children of God?
Yes, this is a very significant thing that Jerzy Kluge would then remember. And this very much is something that's very important in Poland. One of the things that Claire and I discovered that we had a wonderful time in Poland and we hugely admired it, but something that distressed us, we heard there something neither of us expected, which was anti-Jewish remarks, actually horrible. And these were Catholic people, and I don't think they realized how disgusting it was. And we had a discussion about this with them, but there is an anti-Semitism that has existed in Poland, and it seems to me quite horrible that it exists to this day. And it's something that John Paul really sought to tackle, and I think in large measure did tackle, in fairness, I think in very large measure he tackled. And he taught the rest of the world that we're on a prophetic journey with the Jewish people here, that God, through the Second Vatican Council, really called the church to a new relationship there. The relationship's always been there. I mean, Christ was born of the house of David, the Jewish people. It's all very glorious, but we must eliminate an anti-Jewish ranting. And I think that is something that goes back to his childhood and any Pole who lived through the war years and so on. And I was unaware of anti-Semitism being a reality in Poland. It's also something I'd never encountered ever in Britain. And I think it's something that goes right back to his childhood and that friendship with Jerzy. And you can see something beautiful there. You can see the hand of God in this. Very, very deep stuff here.
Right. Now, you're going to be there when something beautiful happens, when he gets canonized, but you also put together a prayer book, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, the Catholic Truth Society in Britain, which is the major publisher of the encyclicals of popes and so on, we had the idea, I've done some other work with them, a very lively young team there, and we had the idea of a prayer book to commemorate the canonization of these two great popes. It's going to be a commemorative thing, something to keep as a souvenir, and it has novenas, meditations for the Stations of the Cross, the Divine Mercy, a packet in an attractive little prayer book that celebrates the canonization but uses the words of these great men. John the 23rd had the most beautiful meditations for the Rosary, Stations of the Cross, and the blend of the two, John the 23rd and John Paul, makes for a really rich read. It was very satisfying working on it, ploughing through the Journal of a Soul, John the 23rd's great spiritual diary, a very traditional piety, very deep, very holy, prayerful man, and then the rich encyclicals and so on.
Not the wild-eyed progressive that some people have tried to.
Absolutely not.
Just right?
Absolutely not. In fact, I found some of his stuff a bit cloying, absolutely difficult for a woman of the 21st century to read without thinking, well, that sounds awfully old-fashioned. But it was also very deep and sincere. And of course, the two men were very different in their upbringing. John the 23rd, pious Italian family, goes to seminary at the age of 12. It's very conventional. He had unconventional things in his life. He was caught up in the First War, and he writes very movingly of his experiences tending the wounded. But it's a very easy, structured life in the sense of easy pattern of where it's going to go. Right. And to the end of his life, he had this large, joyful family of brothers and sisters marrying and grandchildren arriving and so on. John Paul, this extraordinary life. So they're different.
Yeah, he was ultimately left alone, basically.
Yes,
right?
He was completely orphaned. By the age of 20, he had no mother, no father, no brother, no country, no university, no job, nothing. I think the complete devastation of Poland in 1939, is very important. So different from John the 23rd, who had his more conventional life. And of the two, I think we would have to say John Paul's life is going to be, for many years, the stuff of adventure, films, stories, biographies, plays, poetry. It is an extraordinary and thrilling life. Whereas John the 23rd was perhaps almost, along with Paul VI, the last of the conventional popes. Pious family, Italian, a little bit predicted, mark my words, that lad will be pope one day. You can see a pattern here in the 19th century too. It was broken with the Polish Pope. Right,
and we see it as it continues now with our present Holy Father
present Holy Father, Argentinian, goodness me. And so you have a Polish Pope, a German Pope, an Argentinian Pope, and also all of them in this different world after two great world wars, where a certain informality, when Pope Benedict came to England, absolutely marvellous, scooping up babies and kissing the tops of their heads and so on. And people were saying to me, I like your Pope. And I said, well, so do I, as it happens.
Right.
And I'm not sure whether John Paul was the first to break the mould, but in a sense, he certainly did break it. Perhaps John the 23rd was the first with this give your children a kiss, tell them the kiss comes from the Pope. This is necessary and glorious, and it's got a naturalness about it. I just love the way the people see the Pope in an unfathered world as a father, father figure. It's very attractive.
Right. And as you put it there, unfortunately, in an unfathered world, with that, we're going to have to leave it there. And we'll look for that book and also your latest work. And we look forward to the canonization coming up in a few weeks. Speaking with Joanna Bogle, who, along with Claire Anderson, co-authored a book on John Paul II, Man of Prayer, The Spiritual Life of a Saint, published by Gracewing. And also there's the prayer book as well. Join us next time right here on EWTN.